Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, but I'm now a registered therapist, author, and mental health advocate. With me, as always, is my co-host, Duck Maillard. How you doing, Duck?
I'm sweaty today.
Really?
All of a sudden, it became summer in the valley in Southern California. It usually happens like that. One day it's beautiful in spring, the next day it's 95 degrees, and today is apparently that day.
You're saying that as if it's a bad thing. Do you not like the summer?
No, I do. I'm from the Northeast, and I spent 25 years there at freezing. I mean, I don't have the frame for like insulation. And then I moved out here, and I was like, what took me so long? But there is a limit. You know, obviously living in the valley, we've experienced a couple of 115-degree days in recent years. So there's a limit. But yeah, 90. Once you get above 90, I start to get a little uncomfortable.
I like the 90s. I grew up obviously in LA, in the city though, which is it's 10 degrees cooler in the summer and 10 degrees warmer in the winter in the city than it is in the valley.
10?
So
I think you're being.
Is it more?
Oh my gosh, there are days when it's because we've done the like necessitated. We have to get out of the valley when it's 115. You drive to Santa Monica and it's like 76, and you're like, what? What did I do? Why did I choose the valley?
Right. Well, the beach is not my preference because you get that marine layer overcast thing, which is, I like the sun. That's why in the 90s is great for me.
We are alienating 98% of our audience who don't live in Southern California. But, you take the 5 to the 110. And then
the Californians.
Yeah, exactly.
These are the kind of conversations you have when you live in the most beautiful place in the world.
But, there's even a deviation from my house to your house. I was like, oh, I'm seeing the number go up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So anyway, no, there were a few years ago when we were having the bad droughts and a lot of the fires and stuff, I was like, I think I live literally on the surface of the sun. And
did you regret your decision coming up north?
Well, I hadn't really thought about it because the valley was not a huge part of my existence as growing up in LA. I mean, I came out to the valley in high school because I had friends that lived in the valley. But before that, it was like my perception of LA was like, there's where we live and then there's downtown and the valley, and they're both far.
Yeah, and dangerous. Yeah.
So this is an interesting episode we've got for our listener.
Our listener, yeah,
today.
Uncle Dave. You guys will all learn about Uncle Dave in our podcast today.
Well, normally it's a family affair on the show because you and I, we bring some kinship into every conversation we have with others, and it's a warm.
I thought you were going to be like, you're my brother, because you're my brother, man.
Yeah, that too.
But yeah, now it's literally a literal family affair today.
It's a family affair today, and I didn't know what to expect, to be honest. I probably prepared least for this conversation.
Our guest today is Ryan's father, Kenny Dusick. So
I leave that part out?
You did leave that part out. I just wanted to let Uncle Dave know.
Well, my dad, Kenny Dusick, of course, is a big part of my life. And I talk about him a little bit in my book, Harder to Breathe, which I haven't been promoting enough, by the way.
Go buy Ryan's book.
If you haven't bought it.
I read it. It's good.
Yeah, Harder to Breathe. It's relevant to everything we talk about on the show. That's why I mentioned it. But and he is mentioned in the book, but to a certain extent, some of that got cut out because you got to cut it down to size, and we weren't going to cut stuff about the band,
right?
And about me.
Sorry, Kenny.
Yeah, so it was mostly family and friends and people that aren't celebrities.
Right.
Those stories got cut, but it is relevant. The stuff that we talk about in this conversation, I think, is all relevant to my story, but also just my understanding and my education and learning of the things that I talk about as a clinician and as an advocate.
But also as listeners, we all have families, and I don't think it's beyond the realm of reality to say that most families are screwed up in one way or another. Like, we all have our own family drama. Some people, even the families that you think are the perfect family, you look and go, why can't my family be like that? There's stuff going on behind the scenes. And this is a great conversation about, from a perspective that we don't always get. We talk about our feelings. We say our generation, for lack of a better word. But we don't always get the flip side of our parents' perspective on how those decisions made them feel. And Kenny gives a very honest assessment of his side of things, your struggles, how it affected him and his life. So it's a great conversation, very revealing, not short. You'll find out Ryan's dad does have a way with words.
That's a kind way of saying long-winded.
But it's great. It's dad energy to the max.
There's a lot of parallels between my childhood with him and his with his parents. So it's all very informative in terms of what you were talking about in terms of, even the people who had quote unquote perfect childhoods. I mean, I described my childhood as perfect for the longest time. And he did too. He had a very 1950s kind of childhood, which was like, father knows best. So it's kind of what I imagined when I think. So anyway,
Father knows best with like a little Borscht Belt comedy thrown into the side.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
He definitely the Catskills.
Yeah, they pop up a number of times.
Right.
The Brill building. And stuff.
right. So anyway, I don't want to give away too much.
Right.
But it's a great conversation. So without further ado, here is our conversation with my dear old dad, Kenny Dusick, right here on the show. Hi, Kenny Dusick.
Good
Dad.
Do I have to call him Dad for this interview as well, or can I just call him Kenny?
You can call me Uncle Kenny.
All right, sounds good.
Most of our family refers to you as Uncle Kenny. Is that something you have owned with pride, or
I thought it was a little weird with your mother.
Starting early.
I actually ask strangers to call me Uncle Kenny. I do.
That's true. I've noticed that. When did that start?
You get into this space where I personally love to talk to people, as you know, and I meet people in line or whatever, and I start a conversation. And if they're younger, like under 55 or something like that, it's true. Just call me Uncle Kenny, whatever. It does feel good. I don't know why. It feels endearing.
There's definitely a term. I mean, we do that with our friends who are not blood relation, but might as well be family to my son. They're just Uncle Dave or something. You know what I mean? It's
exactly.
It definitely kind of puts it into, you're not just a friend. You may not be blood, but you're as close as family. So.
Did you know he has a might as well be family?
Might as well be.
I don't know what
Marcus
that is.
Welby? What?
My mother and father came to LA from New York right after World War II, right after War II. I was born in 46. And along with them, we lived on a street, David Avenue, little dead-end cul-de-sac, small houses, and half the street was all our family from New York. But next door was Uncle Phil and Aunt Ethel, who were not an uncle or an aunt. They're my parents' best friends. They lived next door. So it was everybody was an uncle.
What was Uncle Phil's catchphrase?
You'll remember it. I'm trying to think.
I hate kids.
Oh, I hate kids. Yes.
A great attitude for an uncle to have.
He was, the kids loved him. He was wonderful. And he had issues. We know that. We won't besmirch him. I loved him dearly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I approached you and said, we think it would be a great episode to have you on the show, what was the main thought or feeling that came from that question or statement?
Nice. It felt good that you would think of me that way, that I would be interesting. I enjoy talking and performing. So
no.
Who is this guy?
Doing my job over here.
I talk too much. It's a kind of a lot of our family are that way and so on. So I thought it would be enjoyable. It'd be fun. And I also was flattered.
Okay. And did you have a thought immediately of what it was that we would be talking about? Or were you like, I don't know?
Well, not a specific thought. I do know a bit about your personal story, of our relationship.
A little bit.
Yeah. And so I thought, oh, okay, this will be kind of a balance between nutty dad jokes and punsterisms and serious-minded introspection about, the mechanics of living this life.
Okay.
It's good to know your role. It's good.
So for the viewer and listener,
we only have one. Oh, man. Hey, Dave, Uncle Dave.
The
Dave.
royal we. If you haven't figured it out already, of course, my dad is a lot of dad jokes, very corny in terms of sense of humor, but everyone, of course, appreciates it because you're usually the life of the party, right? You're the person who can fill any space with good humor and fun. Was that something you were with pride?
Well, it's kind of, I'm going to go back before you answer your question, which is typical for me to take a side note.
Right.
When you said everyone appreciates it, I would say from my profession, that assumes facts not in evidence. There's some people that really don't like that. And I have to temper myself because I have a bit of that, potentially that impulsiveness, ADHD or whatever those things are that we label people with, whereas sometimes it'll be a little inappropriate, you know.
Well, why do you think
weddings great, funerals
Yeah.
not always so good.
Do you have a sense as to where that impulse comes from?
Yes.
Okay. But you're not going to
share that. We're going to save that for the
Well,
next episode.
I'm going to let you fill in some of the gaps here because I have a sense, but I think you guys, you're highly qualified in something.
Yeah.
I don't know. But there's always been this feeling in me. Number one, we were playful. In particular, my dad and my sister and I were playful. My mother is, you never knew my parents, unfortunately, but my mom was more the audience in the family. So there was a lot of play. There was a lot of music and singing and joke telling. We listened to comedy records all the time. Pardon my blooper albums. You ever hear them? Fantastic. Okay. I'm not going to do any of the quotes of the jokes, but we listened to Shelley Berman, all this comedy stuff. And then, of course, later, car renter Mel Brooks, 2,000-Year-Old Man. Mm-hmm. But there was also, on the psychological side, there's this need, and I think my sister, you know Michelle quite well. Michelle, it's just me talking about you and me. No one's listening. Only one fan.
That's right. We only have one. Uncle Dave.
Uncle Dave, exactly. Or as my wife would say, Tio.
See, Tio Dave.
Tio Dave, yes. There's a need socially sometimes to fill the space. Mm-hmm. It's a lack of comfort in the quiet of the room. And you'll have maybe more insight in terms of the reasons for that, but it's something that I felt is like, okay, there's nothing going on here. Maybe I should fill the void.
Right.
I'm not entirely sure what the lack of comfort is with regard to that. Maybe you can share a little insight. I don't know.
Well, I guess in recent years, since I've been a therapist, the dynamic of our relationship has shifted a bit to one of you now coming to me for some perspective on things, which I appreciate. I like the fact that you trust me with, giving you advice or perspective on things. Mm-hmm. And knowing and understanding you and Mom, your backgrounds and where you come from and what informs your personalities and how that informs my personality and my proclivities has been enlightening. And, knowing that the dynamic you've described in your family is your dad was this fun-loving guy who, you speak very glowingly of him. You have my entire life. But you kind of spoke in hushed tones about your mom. Like whenever you or Aunt Michelle the subject of Mom would come up, it would get a little bit more serious. And you didn't speak as much about her as you did about Dad. And in more recent years, I've, discovered, of course, that she was depressive. And you've described her as an audience, right? That you and Michelle and your father were kind of entertaining by nature, outgoing, musical, a lot of laughter, and that she was always more of an audience. And I wonder if silence to you is Mom's unhappy. And you have a responsibility that you took on from an early age to be the entertainer, all of you, maybe to cheer up Mom to a certain extent.
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It sounded
stab.
like we're going in an interesting way.
Tell me where it was supposed to go.
I didn't know my mother was depressed
until
after my dad died. And then the 4 years after my dad died with my mom. And this is the funny part. There's the natural instinct when something serious comes like that is to first make a joke.
Sure.
And of course, in the family, we do have a bit of sick humor. You're at funerals, we do make jokes sometimes. It's our way of coping and so on. But my mom was clearly, in hindsight, once I experienced the last 4 years of her life, she died about 4 years after he passed. And I saw that picture, and then I began to kind of grow and mature more. And so my dad died when I was 23, my mom 4 years later. I realized that she was probably depressed her entire life. And I have a lot of ideas as to what her relationship was in her life and so on. My dad was a Hollywood makeup artist, and he was a songwriter by avocation. But my dad used to produce, is this important?
Yes, please.
My dad used to produce for the City of Hope. they had a group called the Torchiers of the City of Hope. They were pyromaniacs as well. There's torches. Okay. So he put on these shows for the City of Hope, which, by the way, is a very worthwhile organization. They're fantastic. And he would produce, write, and all the members of the group, et cetera, my sister included. I think Mary Tyler Moore performed in it. Musical variety comedy shows, they would do that. My mother there's photographs of her as a chorus line gal with my sister in a tight, not tight, but it's a black and silver bathing suit, maybe where I got the black.
Sure.
It could be.
Homage.
It's familiar, exactly. So he wrote these things, and bottom line is mom was always the audience.
Right.
And she was not, my dad was a storyteller. He wasn't quite as silly as Michelle and I grew up to be. Kind of going afield, I don't know if I've answered.
No, so I mean, sometimes the roles we take as we're growing up are not overtly stated.
Yeah.
It's not that I was implying that it was like, oh my God, we're talking all the time about how mom's sad and we need to cheer her up. It's sometimes just a very subtle, unconscious feeling and motive that drives. So, if you have a parent that is highly anxious, let's say, you all are feeling a little bit like, let's not aggravate, that parent's anxiety. If you have a parent who is entirely self-absorbed and gets upset if anything's not about them, you might find ways to make it always about them.
And like you say, that's a subconscious thing, that it's a learned behavior. As a child, we don't consciously think, I've got to not talk about this because I know that's going to upset mom or dad. It's something that we learn through repetition, and we know what sets off the family,
Right.
And so I think I would say, from my amateur evaluation of knowing Kenny, that like it speaks more to your desire to, like you say, to take care of people and to make people feel welcome and at home. So if there's a lull or a gap in conversation, well, it's your chance to step in and be like, here's something funny that'll elevate the room again and make everybody feel good. I mean, I think it's a totally selfless impulse, but I'll defend Ryan's stab in that it very easily could stem from those same experiences in your family, where you wanted to be the one to be like, hey, I can make another joke here to keep the party going, to keep mom laughing at our, our antics. So whether or not it's a conscious choice is kind of a moot point. It's more about the end result. And
right. And that's why it's so hard
mood.
Oftentimes for people, even in therapy, years of therapy, to figure out where their issues come from and how to overcome them, because some of it is deep programming that you don't consciously understand. It might have happened even in utero, or like when you were 6 months old before you could even speak. You just perceive a certain emotion when you look into your parents' eyes, and the way that you relate to the world is affected by that. Just their temperament, the way that they are either very connected to you or not connected to you for whatever reason. Anyway, this is all psychological.
Look, when
I
I
was bringing something to mind.
Yeah,
sure.
Because you're all right, really, in one form or another. Mm-hmm. He's almost like partially right, and you're all right, because I'm selfless.
I knew I had this thing.
That.
I knew I had this psychotherapy.
No, it's interesting because you think of the first few years as being really the most impressionable, things that can happen to a child in terms of good or bad and trauma. And those first years were extremely protective. I think Michelle and I voiced to one another that we felt, and when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, like we came from the best family in the street. We were the perfect family. That changes later, and it changes dynamically and so on. So I have to kind of look at the periods in my life, in my own development, to kind of best answer the question. Because as a little boy, my sister was highly precocious, and you still are. But she's, sorry, Michelle, she's 4.5 years older than me. So I'm told that at age 2 or 3, she just suddenly one day stepped up on a picnic table and started singing. And she became a very successful performer, et cetera. So I'm the little brother. And fortunately, I think I was the little brother and not the little sister, because I always adored her and I always felt there was no real sibling rivalry that was going on there. And it was kind of like, oh, I want to do that too. I want to be a part of that. The way that changes later in life, and we'll go there now, is first 12 years of my life were blissful. And then problems started to creep in my parents' relationship and so on. And there was stress and strain there. And somehow, and my sister now, when I'm 12 years old, my sister's now a 16-year-old. She was going through the typical teenage stuff, but it manifests itself in ways between my parents, my dad and my sister, my dad and my mom. Somehow they all came to me for guidance and for counseling or to just tell the story. Sometimes extremely inappropriately. I'm not going to do details, but more my mom and my sister and my dad later, we had some very candid talks. So I kind of became and maybe this is, a generational thing. You now have some of this. And I had inwardly even, I would say I didn't mind that, playing that role. But at times it was very inappropriate, and the things that I was learning were inappropriate. So I'm sure it troubled me at times to know about your parents' struggles and so on. So it wasn't my nature to demonstrate my anxiety outwardly or to be overly feeling anxiety greatly, but I'm sure it was there.
And there's a lot of times when we as children, I think I was in a similar place where I acted out a lot as a kid, but it was, for attention. And at school, they said that he just wants to know. That infuriated me because it was insulting to me. I didn't outwardly know, well, if I do this, I'm going to get attention. But my parents were getting divorced. I had trouble at home. I absolutely craved, even if it wasn't positive attention, just attention. Someone look at me. But as I matured and became a sounding board for my mom, I lived with my mother. My father had moved away. I took on that responsibility very seriously as well and was proud of it that my mom trusted me. But also, in retrospect, I think I can see now that it was probably too much for a kid my age to put all that on my shoulders, to worry about my mom's well-being. And there came a time, it happened a little bit in high school where I started to be like, I got to do my own thing. But really, when I became a young adult and a professional actor, and my mom was still going through a lot of the struggles that she was with depression and trying to figure out her role in this world. And I had to say to her, I love you, Mom, and I'll be here for you, but I can't be your savior anymore. I can't be your best friend. I've got to be your son, and I've got to live my own life right now. And she still credits that day to me as like an aha moment for her, of her being like, I'm so glad you had the courage to say that to me and snap me out of a little bit of the funk that I go, well, I can always rely on Brian to be there, So again, I'm not disparaging your recollection of the fact that you relished that role, but I also caution people to realize that we as children don't always know the long-term implications of that responsibility.
Sure. No, there's a lot that you've shared that's applicable.
Right.
Is your mom still?
She is. She's still with us, and she's.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah, she's absolutely a listener. See, she's seen Uncle Dave. They watch it together.
That's why you have a plural now. We have what's your mom's name?
Sandy.
Yeah. Great.
You've met her. She's come to former future shows and things.
It was in the past with the former future.
But right. But her journey is something that I also commend you for in even talking to Ryan right now and saying that, my need to fill empty spaces with a joke or something, maybe it's an insecurity, maybe it's a credit to your ability to still look inward and say, even at my age where some people think they have it all figured out, that you go, maybe the things that I used to do aren't appropriate or didn't work or aren't the right response, but I do them because I feel this need. You know what I mean? It's a credit that we all are still looking to work on ourselves and to change and to improve.
What you're sharing is interesting because in your work, and I've thought a lot about your work because it's interesting, and you are someone that's great to talk to about. But and I've been in therapy, but it's you're always looking for the therapist to tell you, well, where's the line where you cross over, and the therapist will, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, will never tell that to you.
Cross over to what?
Your choices, your behavior, what is too much with mom or dad or whatever in terms of that relationship? You drew a line, right? Sandy, would you, let me put the word into the conversation, codependence, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you consider your relationship with your mom.
It was definitely.
So the question is, there's a balance that you have to find that the line that I'm talking about is where you're being helpful and you're in a healthy, nurturing relationship, where you go over the line where it's become too far for the age of the person and or for the relationship generally, codependent. which we can talk about in relation to you and me. You've enlightened me a great deal in relation to that. And so I think that definitely I became the caretaker of the community, of the family. That was the role that I ended up starting to play. And so when you say relished, I didn't dislike it. I felt in that sense that I was happy that I was trusted, as you said, in relation to your mom. By the same token, it eventually became quietly burdensome.
Yeah.
And I worried a lot about that and some of the outgrowth of that. And I worried, it played out with my mother much more deeply and more often, though my father shared some very deep feelings and so on. So codependence, is that a good thing to explore?
Yeah, well, if you remember...
I might write it off on my taxes next year. I go down from Sandy, I'll write you off. Right. How many codependents can you write off on the tax return? I don't know. It's great.
Codependence was a topic that we explored for the first time when I was in rehab.
Yes.
If you remember. The first few weeks was me just getting acclimated to the process of being sober and what it would take to be and stay sober. And then it quickly went into our relationships, which are extremely relevant in terms of your addiction and how you relate to that and being in recovery. And they kept asking me questions about my partner, Sean, and I would talk about her, and then they would ask me questions about my family, and you kept coming up in conversations. And what would happen, which was interesting, was that my therapist there pointed this out to me. Every time he would ask a question about Dad, I would mention something that I didn't really understand codependence yet at that point, but that was in that realm of over-involvement, caretaking, some of the things that we've discussed since. And then I would immediately apologize. I'd be like, I'm not saying that anything bad about my dad. Like, my dad is a wonderful human being. Like, everyone loves my dad. He's a great dad. He's a very positive influence. And finally, at a certain point, he's like, did I say something bad about your dad? Like, did I imply that he was not a good dad or something like that? Because every time you like follow up.
Was this the therapist that you thought was really transformative?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great question. And it was interesting, just the dynamic between us, because we've always been very close. We've always been very bonded. First with sports and baseball in particular, you being my coach growing up all the time. And then music, you were very much there with us all the years that we were, involved in bands and doing all that stuff. And I always felt that there was just a lot of love and support and pride in the things that we were doing. But to the point where it was like you were living my life with me, probably to a certain extent. And there was, even at 37, 38, when I was trying to get sober, an extent to which we were enmeshed to a large degree. Sure. And so when I invited you to come to visit me, we had a nice brunch. And the first thing after things, the niceties had passed, was like, Dad, we need to talk about codependency.
Sure.
And for the people that aren't aware exactly, because it is a word that gets misused a lot or misunderstood, and I think people use it to mean enmeshed, two people or a family that are too dependent on one another in a lot of ways, and that is part of it. But that's more dependence than codependence. Mm-hmm. Codependence is when one person is getting a lot of their self-worth in being the caretaker to someone else who is dependent, right? And that gets formed by this kind of parentification, where at a very early age, you grow up with a parent who does need your support in some way. And it could be for a lot of reasons. It could be because they have an addiction problem themselves, or a personality problem where they're very a dependent personality, or a narcissistic personality,
or even a physical requirement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Caretaker of a parent who maybe has a disability or something like that.
Or because your parent is a single parent who's working all the time, and you have 3 other siblings, and you're the oldest one, and you end up being the caretaker of your siblings, not out of any reason that's a terrible, bad parenting reason. It's just like that's the reality of your situation, and you become the caretaker in that regard. So you adopt that as part of your self-worth and your personality. And I get the sense from what you're describing, and to a certain extent you as well, because of that parentification that happened for one reason or another, that became central both to your identity and to the feeling of, that's where I'm most useful. That's what I bring to the table. So how does that inform your relationships you've talked about it at age 12 on with your parents, but now you become an adult, you become a partner in a marriage, you become a parent, you become Uncle Kenny to
the world.
Yeah, to everyone, really. So how do you think that played out over the last 50 years?
Well, I will answer that. I was just thinking it was kind of a little charming moment when you nervously opened the idea of codependency. I remember sitting with you also by the pool side, and it has constantly been a reminder for me. This thing that we talk about therapy and where the line is, in my relationship with Gina, his wonderful mother, we do have. Since you guys moved out of the house, I don't think that I would be eating unless I took over the cooking. And she likes that. She likes the fact that I do that. And then I look at that and I say, all right, am I doing too much now? And, and then you start feeling inside, when we talk about how you're feeling about it, because you're joyful and you like it, there does come a time where you suddenly say, as you said with your mom, Sandy, you're doing great. No, it's like, I got to talk to you about this. Mm-hmm. I can't always be the guy.
Right.
You have to kind of stand on your own 2 feet. And it allows me to continue to remind myself and to try to navigate it and work better. I watched a guest on Bill Maher last night. Did you watch that?
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about therapy and how much it helped him. He talked about his relationship with his dad. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was very relatable and empowering in the sense that people who have standing in the community, and this has been it's become a topic that's no longer taboo. And
you're talking about the whole reason for this podcast.
Exactly. And I'm going to talk about something that is very emotional, but that just came to my mind, and I might as well because we're here. As you know well, you may not know, my mother took her own life, okay? And when she died, for the first few years, it was hush-hush. Nobody talked about it. Mm. Oh, it was even I was 27 at the time. It was a hidden secret, and you don't talk about those things, et cetera. I realized for some reason, I did not go into therapy at that point in time, but I'd lived 4 years in the presence of my mom's devastating depression, and I'm left with all kinds of powerful emotions, understanding of myself, but also feeling responsible. They always tell you, it's not your fault, this and that. Yeah. There are ways I could have been better, and we're not going to go into the details of that. But the important point here is that the psychology was, it was as though something dark and hidden was there. And the result was, about 3 or 4 years later, I realized, no, I have to be able to tell people that my mom took her own life and be straight up with it, because it was making me feel like something was wrong with her and with me. Mm-hmm. It was liberating the sense of releasing the anxiety of trying to hide a secret, and being honest with myself about both what was not my responsibility or fault, but also where, no matter how much you shrink or whatever, they'll tell you certain things. They don't always ring true. You certainly you have to embrace and say, how do I honor her and that experience in my relationship with others and the way that I deal with strangers and so on. Suicide being a big one. I'll change gears and just to mix this up a little bit and go to addiction. Okay, I did see the rough of your first, and I know a bit of your story growing up.
Addiction's a big part of my family as well.
My dad, he was my hero, and we had all in all just a blessing for me of a relationship. I spent the day he died of a heart attack, I spent that entire day with him, and when he died, I was left full and complete. I was 23 and my best friend was gone. And I felt, Neil, no offense, Jerry and Gina, you're all best friends. But at that point in my life, it was my best friend. And I was devastated beyond belief in the blackness of that. But I felt that the entire picture had been painted and wrapped. With my mom, it was very different because of the nature of the circumstances. But
it's beautiful.
But
I love that.
Yeah, but going on to the idea of addiction, when I lived in the everything room, and later on in other years, that was the bar. So in another house, there's a little cabinet next to the bed where my dad kept all of his booze. And if I looked in retrospect over the years, my dad was a makeup artist, as I said. He went to work at 4 or 5 in the morning, and he came home at 7, 8, 9 at night, and he was always tired of everything. So let's say when I was 10, he'd come home and he'd pour a little shot. And as that evolved over the years, the glass got filled a little more and more, till eventually he'd be a little blurry-eyed in the evening. And weekends, my mother was always saying, "Shush, Jack." She would shush him.
Leave Dad alone.
Because he was, no, she was shushing him. Because he would get loud. He was not an unhappy guy. He was drinking too much on the weekend. So the end run of that story is, if my dad needed the liquor, it was right by my head on the bed there with the cabinet. So I started to notice Dad coming in at inappropriate times to the liquor cabinet down below. And if so much, I was probably about 15 years old at that point in time. I wasn't a little boy anymore. And I started thinking, there's a problem. So you talk about the codependency or the parentification. I had for 2 or 3 years before then, a lot of conversations, primarily with my mom, my sister on different stuff, and then with my dad a bit about their intimate relationship, inappropriate. But I felt I needed to talk to my dad. And I remember going to him, nobody was in the house, and I go to him in their bedroom. And I said, "Dad, I want to talk to you, but I think we're codependent." So
you had the facility language early on.
Well, I was nervous about it, but I felt it was important. And my dad, who was a strong, handsome, strong, broad-faced Ukrainian family, Russia, that thick, dark hair and broad-faced, and he was probably only about 5'9", but I thought he was big and tall.
Sure.
He was like 210 pounds, barrel chest, 220. And he broke into tears, sobbing when we talked about alcohol and what I thought was wrong. And clearly I hit the chord right there and everything. And I was feeling for him so much because I knew my dad was an emotional fellow. He was artistic, and he had a great sense of art and music and everything. So what did he do? He brought down a box, a gross big carton, and he put all the bottles in there. Notably, he didn't pour anything out of the bottles. He went into Michelle's bedroom. Michelle might have been in New York already, left the house. I don't know, was performing in New York. And he put it up in her closet and left it there. And so, that was kind of it for a while. We didn't talk about it much more. Then I started seeing that he was sneaking into Michelle's room and taking the bottle down and sneaking drinks. So then I was feeling more uncomfortable than before. And I built up the nerve eventually to talk to him again. And I said, I don't feel comfortable about this. If you want to drink, put it back where it is and drink, because I can't watch you.
Yeah.
I feel like you're humiliated.
There's a double betrayal.
Yeah.
There as well.
I went away to school. I was probably 15 or so. I went away to college at age 19. I started at UCLA. Go Bruins, right? Bruin over here. And then I went off to Cal because I was tired of living at home and everything. And my buddies, Jerry and friends so I went up there. And I noticed from my parents, who were having a lot of trouble when I was in the house, and maybe there's some psychological explanation, I had a feeling when I would come back and visit, and then when I moved in afterwards, when I went back to law school and everything, I thought their relationship had improved, and I thought he was drinking less. And I don't know, the sense that I got, I could be totally wrong in relation to this, was that my absence from the house allowed more honesty at different levels in the relationship and in terms of my dad's own personal struggle.
So interesting.
And I thought that, I said, something's changing here. And I think my absence has something to do with it.
That's fascinating because, we've talked about family systems, and I don't want to get too stuck in the psychobabble, but
no.
But there was a role that you played, and you were in the middle of that relationship from 12 to 19, right?
Whether that's a buffer or as an amplifier, one or the other.
If you are correct, and we don't know, they're obviously not here to answer that question, but if you are correct that your absence allowed them to communicate more, that's a testament to the extent to which good-meaning, well-meaning, caretaking and codependent type of behavior can actually be a part of the problem. It can enable
a lack of conversation.
The lack of, because it's you're doing the job for them, and they're stuck in their roles of being divided and using you as a buffer in between. Without you there, they're forced to have to deal with the issues at hand. And so it's so fascinating how sometimes the things that become coping styles start from a place of necessity and come from a wonderful place of caring and wanting to solve a problem either for yourself or for your family within the context of the family system. But that role can become, where it was helpful, becomes a problem at a certain point.
Yeah.
You know, there are questions that we never get to hear the answers to in terms of, speaking of Ryan's history in the band and being a rock star. We know what a lot of people talk about that journey, and they say what it's like. I'm very curious about your perspective. So the first part is knowing what we've already established that you are, which is Uncle Kenny, but a father figure and a really supportive dad. I know, I've seen the videos of you on the side of the stage with the video camera when Cars Flowers was playing small clubs, and then Maroon 5, and you were there along the way.
Sure.
I'm curious there has to have been a moment where it went from, because it's probably a gradual thing. You're like the lobster in the pot, slowly turning up the heat. You're seeing the band progress, but it's a gradual thing. But there has to have been a moment where you go, holy shit, my son's a rock star. Like, was it when they were playing Staples Center, or they won a Grammy, or he was just flying around the world on private? You know what I mean? Like, what was that moment for you and Gina where you were like, you have to kind of almost let him go and be like, I can't be the supportive codependent dad anymore because he's surpassed anything that we ever thought this might become. Was that a proud moment, obviously? Was it a scary moment? Did you feel a little left behind? Like, talk a little bit about that moment where you were like, this has really become a dream come true for him, and what's my role in this?
So I would say the first thing is it wasn't one moment, okay? And I would say the prelude to all of this is my sister's story, which essentially was Michelle was, as a very young girl, precociously talented. My father and my sister had a very codependent he was a great teacher, and he wrote songs. He wrote songs for Jimmy Durante and so on. He wrote I Know the Secret of Santa Claus, that sort of thing. A lot of children's songs. And she would sing all these songs they recorded. Then it evolved more to the classics and the standards and so on. So I watched my sister's career evolve. You know, at age 16, she was on Dobie Gillis. She was performing at Dino's on the 77 Sunset Strip. That was Dino's lounge and bar there. They lied about her age. She was 16. She was the singer at age 16 there. By age 17, she was performing Broadway, all that stuff. I was always there. So when Ryan showed an interest, the boys with your brother and everything, to me, it wasn't about, I didn't worry ever about, you want to be a musician, you want to be an actor. I always thought anything is possible.
Sure.
She had a career that made that believable.
You had a roadmap to see how it could actually happen.
And my father worked in the entertainment industry. I was a makeup artist during summer. That was my summer job. At age 18, I did Elvis Presley's makeup, etc. Another story. But so there was a presumption that big things can happen or do happen. And so when it started with Ryan, it was interesting. When you started with Cars Flowers and the boys came up with the whole story. When I saw you perform the first time, within a very short period of time, I got a notion. I said, the boys were not even 15. You were just turned 16. There was a notion in my head that there could be something special here, but they were terrible. But I said, there's, because so quickly.
I wasn't terrible. No, this is the other guy.
Ryan already had it from his brother's band. But the thing was, they practiced in our garage, and they would argue incessantly about things. They were all bright kids. All the boys were really smart. And they would fight for positions and everything. And then new stuff would come out of that process. So if I were to try to answer your question about a moment, because it was evolutionary and there's too many little moments with the cassette, do this and everything, and then you got the independent record job. Only Ryan knows what the cassette means. He'll tell you another time. But when you talk about, there's a moment, I don't know if you shared it in here, where they were out on their first tour as Maroon 5, and they tear the audience apart. There's 12,000 people who didn't know anything about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who were talking themselves. By the third number, were engaged, and by the 8th or 9th song that you finished, they were extraordinary. And I think we lost this video, whatever. The kids are coming down the ramp, on the side of the stage, and Adam comes right towards my camera, and he says, Kenny, we're going to be fucking stars.
There's our soundbite.
And he looks at me, and the camera was dying of battery. I don't know if I got it. We don't know if hopefully Jesse, you've got it. It's a great metaphor for everything in life. There's only one greatest moment.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you live up to that in your life? Because there's only one worst moment too. And so it's an interesting metaphor for how you live with all the normalcy that's in between.
Yeah.
And not be disappointed with not always hitting your best mark and so on.
You obviously were aware of the struggles that Ryan was going through physically, which I think is how we all thought it was initially manifesting. I think you kept a lot of the psychological struggles and the addiction struggles to yourself. But you saw that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And as a parent, there's nothing worse than when my son is struggling, whether he's sick or whether he's failed at something. I want to take that pain away. I would trade places with him in a second. But you had to be a part of that. I know you took him to a lot of doctors when he came back home from the European tour when he couldn't play, and you were a part of that. And I'm curious about what that was like for you on the other side when you're watching your son struggle and go through this, and then also to the point where he finally had to leave the band, but then also had to go into rehab and admit to an addiction issue that maybe you were or weren't aware of the severity of. Can you speak a little bit about the other side of that coin?
Oh, sure.
And what that was like for you?
Well, I think there's a lot of rationalization that we all share when we're confronted with difficult things.
Mm-hmm.
And so early on, when you were having trouble with your shoulder, I remember being in Virginia, and Trish put some of that special, you see it on the athletes all the time.
Tape.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm,
to take away the pressure, this and that. And so we went to a neurologist who had you taking gabapentin. And I thought gabapentin was something that was rather innocent, it's just going to help you with the pain, that sort of thing. And you can increase the dosage, but it is a neurological suppressant.
Yeah.
It can deaden your awareness of things. It can be, and I remember there was another doctor who said, what are you doing? This is later on in the midst of some other issues in relation to that. So it was confusing as to what was going on, and you feel kind of helpless. You're a daddy, you know and understand this. It's you want to help, and then you feel guilty that you maybe haven't made the right or best choices. I remember feeling really sad when they did a She Will Be Loved video, and you did a buzz in your hair at that point. You're in the video and everything, but I could see and sense the sadness in you at that time, and I felt that. I didn't know how to help it. So leading up to your question in terms of that, there were these signals that there was a problem there, but the rationalization side was, well, I didn't know the full scope of it. And then there were other moments of panic. There was at Robbie's bar mitzvah, I think.
Oh yeah.
All you had to do was drape the Torah coming out, and you had a panic attack. Yeah. Is this okay? We're sharing?
Yeah, of course.
So you were sitting behind me, and we're up in the Bay Area, San Francisco, East Bay. You tapped me on the shoulder, and you asked me to come. I go to the bathroom. You had a panic attack. You couldn't go out there. And I comforted. We had the same thing happen with a reading on Passover at the Goran's house. And we went out, and you were and so I didn't fully understand it, but I regret that this is where you get into boundaries, and where do you go as a parent in particular, as you have a son who's now 46 years young or whatever, you're still our baby, right? When is it appropriate to be assertive at any age as you go through time? And when is it time for you to just bite your tongue and do that? So that when you went into Betty Ford, it was and wasn't a surprise. It was, I had enough signals and enough knowledge to know that there was a problem, but I had kind of covered up and rationalized for myself some of that. The experience there, as we've talked already about that conversation, there was a process, because we went into therapy there before you shared that we were with other families. It was an educational, interesting thing. The first time that we saw you, I had a lot of anxiety leading up to that moment of, I knew you would feel uncomfortable. I felt you would probably feel uncomfortable. I didn't know if you would feel humiliated. One thing you learn as a daddy, you know this, and as an empathetic human being, you know this, that what we worry about in people, unless someone is just a psychopath or a narcissist beyond repair, we know who we're talking about. Unless they're that person, people will embrace you in the things that it's the same theme as before about hiding from our stories and from what hurts us. So that unveiling of that was amazing. And then and you write about it in the book, what has happened since then to a parent who worried deeply about their child and so on. And we'll always worry. You'll always worry. Each of the stages, I think you say in your book and so on, in the first week there, if you had known where your life would take you, and that storytelling is so empowering to people that are hurting and in need.
When we went to Ryan's book signing when the book was first released, you and I talked a little bit. And,
yes.
And I didn't even have any skin in the game other than my friendship with Ryan. And I was so proud of him. And I was so proud for you. Like, I'm getting emotional thinking about it.
Sure.
I was so proud for you, knowing what you must have gone through, watching your son struggle and to see him come through on the other side, successful must have been just a wonderful validation of the whole journey. And for you too, Ryan, I'll turn it around on you a little bit. I don't know how much time we have left. I know we could go for hours on this, but in terms of specifically your relationship with your dad, and him being a part of the ascent so closely, like you say, being backstage and all that, was that one of the toughest parts for you in terms of drawing those boundaries and then also, I don't want to say letting him down or disappointing him or being ashamed of what was happening to you without his knowledge?
I kind of wish that I could release the original cut of the book before I had to edit it down for size, because there are a lot of things we're touching on that were in the book that I had to take out, especially the addiction years, just because my editor gave me the advice. It's like, okay, we've read a lot of books about addiction. We know what that looks like.
Right.
It's like at a certain point, it just becomes sort of
disaster porn.
Yeah, and it's repetitive. It's like, okay, another story about a meltdown, and it's like, look, we all want to please our parents, right? You've told me this before, that even to this day, and in your 70s, that when something good happens in your life, something good happens in your kids or your grandkids' life,
sure,
the first thing you think is, oh, I wish my parents could see this. A lot of people spend their whole life trying to please the parents they could never please. And for me, it was the opposite. My parents were my biggest fans.
Right.
And that probably was something that I just look forward to as, in the same sort of sentiment. When something good happens, I want to share it with them. I want them to feel good about me, to be proud. And so a lot of my achievements and things that I want to do in life, there's been that impulse to want to share it with them. And so, of course, then when I'm not doing well, there's that feeling, not just that I'm letting myself down, but that I'm letting my family down, right? And there was that, I don't think at the time when things started going bad, that it was specifically like, oh, I don't want to let my parents down. But there was just this overriding feeling of not wanting to let everyone down, whether it was my bandmates, my parents, just everyone in my life, because there was such a positive, just warm community of people around the band coming up from starting in our garage, through all of those years of evolution. I mean, we're talking about a decade of going from being a teenage boy to being a man out in the world on the biggest stages in the world. And so with all of that love and support, and, my friends at UCLA, all of that community,
sure,
there was this feeling when that was slipping away from me that I'm letting all of those people down. Yeah. And so that was a terrifying thing. And it really struck to my core in terms of my self-confidence and my self-esteem. And I think there was a sort of feeling when I did have to finally come to grips with the reality was what it was that I was leaving the band, and that this wasn't going to be the life that this was all leading towards, that I was imagining, and that it was going to be different. There was just, I wanted to crawl into a hole.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really face the people. And it got really hard, like, to go to events where the band was going to be there, even though I wanted to be there. That's when the drinking started to really escalate, because I would have to get drunk to, like, put on this mask of, like, oh, everything's fine, and, like, I'm still having fun, I'm still a rock star.
You took us to my band. You took us to a bunch of Maroon 5 shows, where that was very much the kind of vibe. It was like, yeah, we're still having fun. I'm totally cool with this. But you weren't totally cool with it.
You saw the character then.
I saw the character, yeah.
And it was the same thing with family events, I think, to a certain extent. It was like, but slightly different. Not that I wanted to show up and be a rock star, but that I loved that feeling for a brief moment in time. Or I guess it wasn't just when we started having success. It was in the years before that, when we were leading to the success, that everyone was just so excited for us and for me. And there was just so much enthusiasm and support of it, that I still wanted to just get that feeling. I wanted to show up and still be that guy, like this golden boy who everyone was looking at was just like, oh, Ryan's going off into the world and doing great things. And so I would, like, do whatever I could to get into that place. If it meant, like, not drinking for a few weeks before a family event, and then having just enough drinks to show up and be, hey, I'm Mr. Worldly. I've got the attitude, but I'm positive. And inside I was in a lot of pain. And so it was kind of exhausting having to put on that mask that I wasn't feeling. But, you know, to fast forward to when I finally went into rehab and when it started recovery, you could look at that as like, oh, look how much I'd have to disappoint my parents to admit that I'm an alcoholic. But it wasn't that at that point. No. It was the most freeing thing that had happened to me in a decade. Because when I finally reached that place, when I had been totally humbled by my addiction and everything that I was dealing with. You mentioned the panic attacks. I was daily panic attacks. I mean, anxiety disorder to the point almost of total agoraphobia, just like the inability to be around other human beings without being drunk or being on medication. And I was hiding all of that. I was just having to show up and put on a mask, and I couldn't hide it anymore. So the fact that I could just admit what I was going through, I kind of wanted to just yell it from the mountaintops. And I wanted to tell my parents, I wanted to tell my friends, both because it was freeing and it was an act of surrender to this thing, which is what I needed more than anything. But also because it was accountability. If everyone knows that I'm an addict, that everyone knows that I need help, then by my admitting it, it's throwing down all of my defenses. It's like, now I have no excuses. If I show up to an event and I'm pretending that I'm having a ball being drunk, hey guys, how you doing? Like that, they would know.
Yeah.
And so I knew, like, this was it. The jig was up, and this was going to be a dynamic shift in my life that would come after this. And so it was very freeing. I felt a huge weight off of my shoulders. But I had to be ready for that. I mean, it's not like 5 years earlier, that wouldn't have been the case, but it was then.
More often than not, the outcomes are pretty bad in terms of addiction and alcohol. And hopefully that's changing. And so on the side of the parent thing and the whole thing, enjoying this moment, you know, the whole thing is every single day that we get to experience this is a gift. It really is. And it's corny. I know, Gina, but it really is. It is a gift. You talk in your work, not you necessarily, but mindfulness, where being in the moment, the past, we made our mistakes, and tomorrow may or may not work out, but let's be in today, and it gives us comfort and so on. So what we're reminiscing, and I guess this is a part of, is it still mindfulness to reminisce and not ruminate over bad events, but to actually visit them and make them relevant to what you are doing today? I don't know if that's mindful or what. Something else came up. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is my lack of comfort sometimes in delegating tasks to other people, right? And we did the word control as a part of this discussion, or lack of control and so on. And it's kind of complicated, but what came to mind was a movie, okay? And I thought, well, how would I share my reference to Holly Hunter's role in the movie Broadcast News, right?
I'm with you.
Type A personality, right?
Because the character she plays is genius.
Yeah.
She gets in a taxi cab. And by the way, Michelle, this is you. You're in New York City, and we spent a lot of time in New York City, and particularly the entire summer of 1962 I spent with my sister, just the two of us. She was on Broadway. I was 15 and a half years old. Wow. It's a great story. It's another podcast. We get in the cab. Well, look, if you take Lexington across, no, cut through the park there. And the guy's driving, he drives us all day long. No, make a right turn here. And Holly Hunter has that same scene where she's telling them all what to do. Right. So relating that to this conversation, I have this thing where I have trouble delegating because I think I can do it better. Mm-hmm. I know they're going to screw it up. And there's an ambivalence in me in relation to that storytelling because on the one hand, oftentimes I'm right. They're going to screw it up and they're not going to do it the way I want it. But the other side of it is, assholes, shut up. They can do it just fine. Why are you inserting yourself in doing that? I've been proven right enough times to still be ambivalent about it in the sense that, and I've had to say, well, this is not right of you, Kenny, to be controlling and trying to do that. What is this tendency about? And you're right. Maybe you'll do it a little bit better, or maybe they'll do it a little bit better. Does it really matter? Mm-hmm. Does it really matter? So I throw that out as a subject because control comes back. For me, it folds a little bit back into the question that we're talking about before, which is codependence. And the idea, you say dependent and codependent, whatever, but also controlling. Mm-hmm. And because, there's this issue in all of our relationships where it can be unhealthy, where we are trying to control the actions of the others in our lives, whether they be our children, our spouses, or whatever.
I have found that sometimes I have not set my son up for success because I didn't let him solve problems. A lot of times I'd let him try something twice and be like, let me just do it. I'll just do it. Let me show you how to do it. Even now, like he's starting to mess around with GarageBand and he's like making music and recording. And I was like, well, see, you've got the mics overblown. Let me just you got to get the bass part, And I'm like, no, I should just let him screw up and make horrible music because he's loving it and he's having fun. So yeah, I think there is an element of control that it's difficult to let go of when you go, especially when it's things that that you have an expertise in. Sure. How can I, as a bass player, let my son play bass poorly? I have, you know what I mean? Sure. But yes, there is a balance that I think you have to hit with your family, with friends, with everybody, of like knowing your role and knowing when it's time to let hands off and let somebody make their own mistakes and grow and learn, and et cetera. I assume you'd suggest the same thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word controlling, not just control, but controlling, your mind goes immediately to it's a malignant type of thing. It's manipulative. It's somebody wanting to exert their influence over somebody else in a way that they're. It sounds really negative. Controlling, just like every other coping style, can come from a very wonderful, loving place, like you're describing. Right. Wanting your kid to succeed or wanting to be helpful, like, let's get to the solution quicker. I know the solution. Exactly. Let me give it to you, and that can, and I know for you, that's the impulse 9 times out of 10. And when it comes to your relationships with family, is to insert yourself in a way that is going to be helpful. And that's, I know, something you guys have had to figure out in terms of the dynamic between the two of you. For me, it was different being your child, of course, because I just, at a certain age, especially if your parents are great and loving, you just assume that they know everything and that they're perfect and that everything they do is right, and you just defer to them. So I never had like any pushback to you for the longest time until I realized as an adult that I need to start to make some of my own decisions and because I talk about this in the book. Like I really didn't experience failure before I was
that was the word that you mentioned and has been going through my mind here as we're talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, at age 14 or so, when I had my first failures in baseball, at a school that was very challenging, and certain teachers that were difficult, I wasn't really prepared. I hadn't really built resilience to deal with that kind of failure because I had such a supportive, such a insulated environment with parents that were very involved and very loving in that way. What's funny is that this is a perfect segue into the House of Blue Star.
All right.
Right? I actually had...
You were thinking about that.
Did you sit in on the drums? Is that what happened?
No. And I'll give the prelude to it.
Okay.
Don't you shut up. Shut up.
Okay, you do it for me.
Yeah.
Well, no. Exactly. No, because the more interesting part of this story will be what follows after. You say, and what was the more interesting part of the story? And I'll tell you that after we share it. While you were out as Cara's Flowers, and they were performing at the Whiskey, at the Roxy, the Dragonfly, and all these things. You're right. I was filming a lot of this stuff, but I would go in there and I'd listen. And they had a band that was they started with grunge, and within 3 months, they were something different, as I alluded to before. And Adam had this more lyrical voice. It wasn't the raspy thing. And by the same token, there were Jesse on the guitar, and Adam, and Ryan. We used to talk about Ryan as a lead drummer in the sense that you were doing things in elements. Forget the great virtuosity of any of them, because they weren't great musicians yet or anything like that, but they were unique.
Mm-hmm.
And they were doing things rhythmically and melodically that were attractive and different, that they were familiar in this. All, Western music has got to be familiar, I guess, but then it's got to be something a little different that attracts you. So I'd go in and I listen. The guy on the soundboard is chewing gum or drinking a beer or whatever. And the band would come up there, and I couldn't hear the lead guitar. I couldn't hear Adam singing. So I got in the habit of going over to the board. I eventually went over and I tipped them all. And I go to the thing, I said, look, there's going to be an instrumental piece in the middle here, whatever. Make sure you've got that guitar forward. We can hear it in the mix. So I got used to doing this or whatever. Now, when you did
the Viper Room?
The Viper Room.
Yeah.
I go to the Viper Room, and this guy meets up with me, Frank, and I talked to him a little bit beforehand. And he goes up in the booth. It was the best sound I had ever heard you before. It was the sound that you needed. He comes down. I gave him $20, which at that time was probably 1994 or 5, something like that. So he goes to the House of Blues. And of course, I mosey over I've been doing it for a year. Mm-hmm. I mosey over the sound, but I start talking about, well, he's going to come up with a thing, and I'm telling this and that. So I did that, and apparently it was very humiliating for Ryan.
It didn't go over well.
Ryan, no, but I didn't know how. Tell him from your perspective what happened there.
Well, you were involved,
Too involved.
And I mean, look, you are an attorney. That was helpful to a large degree. I remember, I used to come off stage, and you would always have a million notes immediately when I'd come off stage.
Oh, really? See, I've forgotten that part.
Yeah, and it was usually positive and constructive, but the constructive stuff I didn't want to hear the second I came off stage. And so that would become frustrating for me, even though it was helpful.
Terrible.
Like if I had a really good show, and when I came off stage, I just wanted everyone to be in a good mood and celebrate it. And if it were a bad show, I didn't want to hear about it. I already knew it was a bad show, right? So of all the clubs that you can play in LA, the House of Blues had the best sound by far. You came on stage, the monitors sounded amazing. They were rich and like the people who were working there knew what they were doing. And so I had no doubt. And of course we come on stage, and the first thing I see is my dad standing like right over the sound guy. Because I'm on stage and you can see the sound guy's just like right there.
Was this sound check or performance?
This was the show. We had already done sound check. We were the first band up, I think. So nothing had changed. We had gotten the sound and everything. It sounded great on stage. And I see my dad standing there and like pointing stuff out to the guy. And I'm like,
you're John C. Reilly in Boogie Nights. You're like, I think it's taken away from his vocals. You heard him.
So I'm already a little bit, like, I'm sure that you're annoying this guy. He's probably more likely to fuck up the sound because
sound was good,
right? If you're talking in his ear, he's gonna be like, well, let's see now, and turn the So I was a little bit peeved, and then it was a great show. It was like the best show we'd ever played.
It was great.
And the second that I come off stage, you come over to me and you're like, it was good. But
oh my God, that's terrible. I feel so bad.
We couldn't. It was just like we couldn't. In the first 30 seconds, you couldn't hear Jesse's guitar or whatever. And I was like, I think it was the first time that I was just like, Dad, you know what? I don't need your help with this, okay? I saw you behind the board. We're at the friggin' House of Blues. We don't need you there, like doing that. And I don't need to hear all the things that could be better about the show. That's how I remember it.
So the reason I brought up the House of Blues.
Yeah.
You noticed that?
Yeah.
The reason I brought it up relates to what we were talking about earlier. which is what we've talked about, is the evolutionary process of self-examination. When you wrote your first draft of the book, which was, is it 3 years now ago?
Yeah, it's been a few years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I asked you to take that section out. It was embarrassing to me. The reflection of, boy, I was an idiot. That was awful. When you say I was giving you notes, I didn't really remember that, but that's horrible. No, I'm serious. And so it was embarrassing to me when you're writing the book. But I had a couple of drinks. No, coming in here today, I said, I got to own up on this, and we'll let you tell the story, do the whole thing. It's that process of self-examination. It's an evolutionary process. It's the idea of there is no perfection. It's the journey. It's not the ultimate goal. The thing is that the journey in terms of your life, for me as a parent and for your mom as well, has been magical. It's had its moments of terror and sadness and worry and fear. And it's come, and we know that there'll be other moments in all of our lives that will be traumatic, and that we have, and what we're doing is we're building a better appreciation for the great things to come, and more resilience for the things that inevitably come that are going to be difficult. A lot of people have said this, and that is, we learn more from our failure than we learn from our successes.
Yeah.
And so when we have our little kids and we're just applauding them all the time, we're giving them awards for nothing or whatever, they're not getting those skills that you need when somebody says no. I think it's been in the news lately, maybe it was Bill Maher or whatever, they said like 20% of parents of kids today go to their job interviews with them. It's like, really?
There's been a whole generation, of course, that was raised under the premise that, you just, you build up their self-esteem, you show them nothing but love and affection, which is wonderful. But to me, to a certain extent, it has been an overcorrection from previous generations that were too cold and too stoic and too disciplinarian. To me, and this is maybe a whole other episode, we don't want to go all the way back to that, where you become authoritarian in your parenting style. But we also don't want to be the kind of parent that is like, doesn't allow your child to fall down and have to pick themselves up. I think there's a happy medium between them. You can be a loving, compassionate parent who is there to listen to their feelings and validate them. And then also tell them sometimes, all right, it's fine. You'll get this. Just keep doing it. You'll figure it out. I'll let you do it.
Yeah.
So that's the bow
Can
on
I
that.
give one little metaphor in relation to this? You can tell the child, don't touch the stove. And eventually the child's going to touch that stove probably. And then they're going to get their own lesson. There's a difference between touching the edge of the stove and putting your fingers in the flame, right? And so and it's all age appropriate and adjustable as to where you. So for the parenting thing, for Adam and friends out there and everything, it changes over time, but the too much is where maybe they can touch the side of the thing and see that, but are you going to let them put their hand in the flame? No. And so
we use common sense, and like you say, it's a sliding scale.
You tell the story, I think, of your mommy spanking you the one time she spanked you. You were going to run in the street and you were like 2 years old or something like that.
Yeah, that's in the book.
Yeah.
Anyway,
somewhere in there, listen, somewhere in there was a perfect wrap up of the whole, of our whole conversation, and also the relationship that we were exploring today. I think, it's a testament to you coming on here and being open to being attacked and criticized and vilified the way your horrible son did, and coddled and loved the way your nephew Duck did.
Is the right title for that.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go. Living in a house of blues. This episode. Yeah. But we really thank you for coming on. I think it's an incredibly insightful conversation for listeners, fans of Ryan, fans of this podcast, to kind of find out a little bit about what makes everybody tick. And I think they got a peek into that window today. This isn't my first time. I know what I'm doing.
Did a good job wrapping it all up.
That's what I'm here for.
Well, why don't you take us out then?
Take us out.
Normally I do.
Thanks for listening. Our thanks to Kenny Dusick for a great conversation. It's been another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast with Ryan and Duck. We hope you tune in next week for another episode. See you later.